For some time now, it's been apparent to many creators and critics alike that the general understanding of criticisms of an art form are based not only in the art itself, but the presentation and framing of the criticism. As well, it seems to matter a lot less about what you say, and more of how you say it. Storytelling is just an incredible invention. I love it. I love watching, discussing, and deconstructing characters and story to their foundational component parts, in the pursuit of reaching some enlightenment as to why I find certain things about an artist's work good or bad. And right there, I already have to stop. This is the source of so much confusion and anger in the critic community. Conversations become unhealthy when this topic comes up. People have been pulling their hair out over this idea of assessing value in art, and it always inevitably ends with both sides shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, they're a lost cause, they just don't get criticism. It was a topic that really interested me though, so I ended up doing some digging, and after an arduous amount of time, research, and reflection, I feel there's a slight chance that I may possibly have an ounce of credibility to talk about this subject. Maybe. There's something about the words good and bad that get everybody incredibly riled up. And it's not a real mystery either. Most descriptors like these are just so non-specific, making it next to impossible to understand what someone's actually attempting to say. I'm going to be dissecting not a full movie, but the methods by which a movie is explored. And in the sphere of online media criticism, there exist two prominent groups of critical thought: the Objectivists and the Subjectivists. In essence, promoters of objective criticism argue for an unbiased approach to assessing a piece of work, to judge the text on its own merits without the influence of personal feelings. Meanwhile, subjectivism is in favor of audience interpretation, with an emphasis on thematic prominence and an audience member's personal experience. This format is often described through the imagery many have dubbed lenses. For the record, my view of these sides aren't based on any one person, but the views of the community as a whole. And from what I've seen, the general opinion from one side to the other usually devolves to, you aren't making arguments, you're just talking about your feelings, and your arguments don't impact the art, you can't treat it as math equations. This video is going to be a delicate lobotomy of these two viewpoints, and I will be putting to the test how faithfully they both apply their criticism to the art. I believe both sides are right and wrong about different things, and while they may be unintentional, they've absolutely negatively affected the environment of critical discussion. So I'm going to try to properly explain what those actually are. There's going to be a vast array of potentially unfamiliar terminology used throughout this discussion to anyone not super into philosophy or literary theory, but I will do my best to be clear and concise. So with that, let's begin. The first ground we have to cover is our terms, since this whole conversation is banking on our mutual agreement on what words mean. But unfortunately, it's important to keep in mind that it ultimately comes down to context, as many of these words have multiple meanings, and they're constantly subject to reinterpretation, as is everything. All of these terms are good to know, but for all intents and purposes, the one that's most immediately connected as the centerpiece of what I'm talking about is judgment. And I know it's weird that I'm doing this, it's weird for me too. I feel like the glossary of a high school textbook. But I'm going to be speaking a lot about semantics and get pretty pedantic about how definitions are used as we go on. So first, we're going to discuss the foundation of these two viewpoints, and since trying to do this without examples will melt my brain, let's start with a comparison of these concepts of objective and subjective in action. If we're using simple examples, objective statements sound like Marty McFly is prideful, and Woody wants to get rid of Buzz Lightyear. Both of those statements refer to the motivation of the characters as it's represented in the film. That's ground zero, step one. Alternatively, when an audience goes in to watch those movies, they may say, I like Marty's outbursts, and I dislike Woody's jealous nature. Those are clear-cut in the opposite direction. The audience member is projecting their emotions towards the objective material from the characters they're viewing. Plain and simple. And this is a good time to bring up authority. Making arguments is part and parcel with criticism. I mean, I'm doing it right now. But the degree of authoritative speech can absolutely impact the perceived validity of your statements, as the lines between these terms often cross. Subjectivity is normally implied in objective statements. If something is objectively provable, you will most likely end up agreeing with it. But whether or not something is objective requires that proof that doesn't rely on an opinion. By that same token, your subjective opinion can just as easily line up with objectivity. The big difference here comes down to intention, and whether or not you care whether your opinion lines up with facts or not. In the pure subjectivity example, there's no stress on asserting anything truthful. This person is just expressing a personal preference. It's instinctive and reactionary and doesn't require verification to be valid as your opinion. Emotions don't try to be facts, even if they may end up agreeing with them. It's irrelevant to the conversation because anything beyond feelings is not even factoring into the conversation. When you place the condition of belief onto the front end, you're beginning to change the structure from an enjoyment perspective to an argumentative perspective. While not necessarily being inherently confrontational, you are reflecting or internalizing an idea. This format will most likely derive from the same reactionary response as the subjective opinion, but the difference is, again, found in your passion or investment in the argument. You're not always going to be just internalizing an idea, you can also be asserting faith in that idea. This can be expressed through reason or evidence, or simply a sense of intuition. And when your level of certainty is high enough, that preface is dropped entirely, stating the judgment with a bold-faced authoritative approach. But does simply stating something with authority make it true? The polar opposite statements aren't a really good representation of how critics talk so much. More often than not, you'll hear something more like, Marty's desire for musical recognition is a powerful thematic flaw, or I think Woody's actions prove he doesn't deserve to be the leader of Andy's room. Again, we're using a lot more complex descriptors that require extra explanation, and are all presenting the statements as substantial value judgments. So what separates them all? Discussion is complicated, and figuring out what makes up the content of those conversations is another foundational must. This is the fact-value distinction, and I like to think of it as the line bordering sensory perception and moral perception. One is very easy to prove through analysis and verification. The other requires reason, intuition, and less concrete methods of judgment. It's the difference between the reality of true and false and the ethics of good and bad. This distinction reveals an entanglement of ideas, and the search for where the line is drawn is perpetual. Many on the objectivist side will argue that you can pull facts from moral behavior, and subjectivists will argue the exact opposite, that there is no objective truth to artistic expression. You could say this is the origin point of these debates. What started out as a discussion on art quality quickly turned into a metaphysical breakdown on human nature. Now, I haven't spent decades of my life devoted to the study of transcendental idealism. I don't have a PhD in ethical intuitionism. I barely have a grasp on what those even mean. But what I can say with certainty is that this debate did not start with art, and was absolutely not the main point of those that began to ask these questions. But fortunately, that's not the reason I'm here. I'm not trying to discover some hidden secret of objective value that has eluded philosophers for millennia. Most of these ideas are just theories anyway. I'm here to streamline art criticism. So long as people are able to recognize the distinction, a conversation can be had about what it actually means to hold value and how we determine what is valuable. So what are people trying to say when they use subjective or objective in this artistic context? This is where the two big groups separate and divide into subcategories of philosophical thought. Most people's opinions will differ in one way or another, but the whole debate boils down to whether or not we can prove morally objective value. Again, I'm not here to try to prove one way or the other, but something that's caught my attention has been the rabbit hole of reason that people seem to encounter whenever discussing art quality. The first layer is in determining what purpose it holds. Practically, it doesn't have any. But art is so broad a topic that distinguishing one single purpose is impossible. Art can be provocative to spark and motivate ideas, informative to provide insight, emotive to stir strong feelings, the list goes on. If we're specifically talking about narrative storytelling in movies, the purpose will mostly fall into the latter category. But then, moving a layer deeper, the successfulness of expressing that emotive idea all comes down to execution and craftsmanship. And that whole scale for quality is determined by standards. I suppose you could think of it like the different prescription lenses for glasses, or a box in the basement labeled with old VHS tapes, or however you're trying to categorize it. Once again, the impasse is in whether these standards are objective or not. And this is where much of the confusion comes from. You can hold a consistent standard for anything, and claim it as normative, but not objective. Every standard regarding quality will be based on your intuition, your beliefs, some would even say,
a feeling.
I don't know if our moral compasses have any objective value to them. I really don't. our glorified skin mechs have pretty limited perception, and I'm not brave enough to claim a side yet. But something I will say is that humanity's shared moral worldview is accurate enough that even if we are flying blind into the abyss, we can still trust that people can agree on basic truths, like the murder of innocents is wrong. To the best of my understanding, there isn't any way to make that claim as inherent to the object. What instead we can do is qualify the statement through the use of criteria, cross-referencing it with references to reality or accepted values to assign a prescribed, consistent standard. A normative assessment of the objective material is based on subjective parameters of quality through the commonly accepted definition of terms. So think of it like a pyramid. Way up in the clouds, you have your feelings, purely subjective, not even a part of the conversation. Then, looking at the pyramid itself, the foundation of everything is in the terms we use. Again, this goes into that subjective rabbit hole of language being incredibly fluid, and words only meaning what we make them mean until we make them mean something different. But once we agree on the terms, the discussion can move forward. So above that, we have the source material. That's where our unfiltered objectivity comes from. We have an actual origin point for every reference made in an argument. As for the top two sections, we have our assessment, being the little value box or lens you're holding up to a piece of art, and the judgment parameters, being your personal value criteria that build up that box. So this 5D chess hierarchy is really the crux of everything I'm trying to talk about here. You can see factual truths and interpret perceived moral truths. Everything is connected. The terms are used to define the parameters are used to assess the material, and the material is analyzed on the basis of a consensus on terminology. You judge or make assessments from what you see with what you believe. And that's because art is complex. It's not a single statement, but a whole spectrum of abstract ideas. As human beings, we have honed the process of constructing drawn, visual, and story art throughout the centuries. And we've managed to become incredibly sophisticated in our methodologies for finding out what we generally value and being able to express that in ways that connect with viewers. But generalizations are still just that. They're based on what people feel, that gut instinct and shoulder angel that tell you right from wrong and good from bad. And it's also safe to assume that time can change these standards. A good example is jump scares. What used to feel terrifying to audiences has become ridiculed as a cheap trick. But was it always that way, or have people's opinions on it changed? Again, I don't know. But as always, the tenor of the conversation is as important, if not more important, than the actual content. So for the sake of extra clarity, we can use an arc example from the film that nobody has ever talked about! In the story of The Last Jedi, Luke Skywalker's character is wildly different from his previous incarnations. He has, in the past, been shown to be a heroic figure that values family and friends above all, and is willing to die before betraying those values and the ones he cares about. In this iteration of the character, he has isolated himself from the rest of the galaxy due to a past mistake where, while subversively peering into the mind of his sleeping nephew, sees a darkness that frightens him into an attempt at murder. So he pulls his lightsaber on him and ignites it. And with his weapon in the air, he too late realizes his mistake. The story has provided a short moment to reflect on his actions and reveals the character's motivation in a single scene to bridge the gap between the in-universe story break of roughly 30 years. If we pull apart this last paragraph I just read off, there's a lot being said, and all of it is factual information backed up by the content housed in the film itself. The only thing I pulled as external reference is the character's origin in sequence in a previous story. And this brings in much needed context for the argument. So if I were to go about this methodically, I'd break everything down to semantics, defining the words or terms that need to be elaborated on, and providing whatever additional context is needed to understand the situation fully. Only then can we actually begin to make an assessment. In this Star Wars example I just used, the values or lenses I'm applying are character consistency, world-building cohesion, human realism, and scene story pacing, to name a few. And I know this is getting super finicky, but please just hear me out. This is the hear me out video. Character consistency. Probably the foundation of what defines character as it's classically described. In a series of events, one motive needs to follow the other, events and emotions take place with a cause-effect relationship, and are expressed in an understandable sequence. They simulate the humanity of real people through the changes they undergo throughout a narrative. World-building cohesion. The constructed setting contained within the bounds of the story is coherent and flows naturally. The world feels lived in, almost like in-universe there are people living outside of the current plot. The societal systems present often take the form of some civilization, government, or culture, and the story pieces everything together for a realistic backdrop for the narrative. Human realism, a one-to-one simulation of real human anatomy, psychology, and mental capacity. The ability to represent someone that could theoretically exist on Earth. Scene story pacing. The scenes move from point A to point B without missing essential details needed or time necessary to understand and believe the progression of events and character motivations. If you're not starting to see what's happening yet, I've just demonstrated the connection between how all of these standards or lenses I've used could reasonably be placed in the value box for the group of film viewers that advocate for logical consistency resulting in both character and thematic payoffs. That is the group or literary theory you can expect from my criticism. And by and large, people can be placed in these communities of thought that represent different beliefs or value sets, in this case, for the purpose of critique of film. But since, again, there are so many different ways to say the same thing, and so many ways the same words can mean so many different things, it's really hard to get people to agree when it comes to specific examples. Going back to that Star Wars example, the biggest gripe I have personally with the film is its handling of Luke's character and how much they changed him without enough support. But what do I even mean by support? And how much would I consider enough? An extra 10 minutes of backstory? Is there a line or threshold that needs to be crossed for me to consider that a good element of the script? Is this all based on my subjective interpretation, or is there some self-evident metric for how much backstory we should get proportionate to the amount of character change that has occurred? And that's the thing, storytelling is not an exact science. People tend to agree when it's more drastic. For example, if there were no flashback scenes or explanation in The Last Jedi, more people would have questioned the legitimacy of Luke's transformation. But then it becomes a matter of degree, and that right there is at the heart of argumentation. But back on point, essentially large groups tend to view art through a similar or the same lens. The lens favored by the extreme end of the Subjectivists is reader response theory, where perception is fundamental. For Objectivists, the more radical thinkers will end up agreeing with the ideas in structuralism, where narrative structure is rigid and universal. But this is where everything I've spoken to up until now comes to a head. Regardless of what metric for quality you look for, regardless of whether or not any form of truth is provable, it all comes down to the root of the discussion, which is criticism. Levying points and counterpoints against a piece of art for perceived quality is what the objective-subjective debate has always been about, and both sides of the argument need to acknowledge something. For most who attempt to qualify a film with terms like good and bad, hopefully this video has shown how much weight those words hold in regard to an assessment. The biggest problem with communication on the objectivist side is the assumption of agreement of terms and the universality of standards. I've seen far too many qualifiers with a far too liberal amount of vague terminology, and that's just it. Terms like these have become containers for other sets of words that can entirely negate the textbook definition of objectivity and subjectivity because of the point of reference the term is using. So have we gone past the point of no return? Are we so far gone that there's no hope to repair the semantic bomb we've dropped on ourselves? I really couldn't say. My biggest sticking point is, and has always been, clarity. And I get it, people are used to speaking in a very straightforward manner, which leads to the need for clarification. But I've seen so many cases where someone will say so-and-so story is objectively good or bad, or cite their standard as common sense, and it automatically leads the other side to view your argument as disingenuous, since there isn't a universal dictionary for the rules of common sense. Simply clarifying the normative nature of your argument from the start would make conversations like those so much easier. So my suggestion would be to pay closer attention to how you use words like good and bad, if for no other reason than the fact that it's pragmatic to allow the other side to understand your arguments and not simply stating your opinions as facts. And look, I'll cop to it. I'm absolutely guilty of the same things I'm criticizing others for. My comprehension on this topic used to be non-existent. And even now, I still have a lot to learn. But when I say these words are used incorrectly, I really mean they're unhelpful. That also supposes, however, that this requires a certain definition and that the terms aren't constantly in flux anyway. That's what's so crazy about semantics. It means something until we as human beings decide it doesn't. That clarity is what video essays like this are all about. And if something is wrong with my criticism, please correct me. In the end, I'm just trying to push the wagon same as everyone else, so we can understand each other better, as being able to express our ideas the way we want is simply the groundwork for content creation of any kind. I've just spoken a lot about how important it is to pay attention to the use of language in critical discussion and analysis. But the biggest sticking point subjectivists seem to have is that they don't see criticism as constructive or prescriptive. They can certainly make prescriptive judgments and refer to their personal experience to analyze something, but they won't ever claim that there is any right way to do something, and their criticism becomes rather impenetrable. The issue is not in their judgments, but in their approach. There are many right ways to tell a story. I think it's quite a good thing to be against a monopolistic approach to storytelling, and it shows positively that they're willing to promote others with fringe opinions, as crazy ideas can lead to great exceptions to the rules of storytelling. But in order for there to be exceptions, there have to be rules. And I know a lot of people, including myself, that don't like to use the word rule here. There are many structures laid out for how some of the best stories are made, and most normal people would agree that they're more vague guidelines, but subjectivists are so afraid of even acknowledging a format as possible that many will automatically have a knee-jerk reaction compelling them to believe that nothing in film is quantifiable and everything is an opinion. A common trait of objective viewers is noting issues small and large, indiscriminate of their impact on the overall message or goals of the story. Quite often they'll see nitpicks, plot holes, and inconsistencies as details worth discussing, which many have decried as unimportant in the big picture, leading again to that knee-jerk reaction. The thing I hope everyone can get out of this is don't treat the other side as the enemy. At the very least, try not to feed the ever-expanding circle jerk of the internet by keeping a closed mind. The ability to hold such rich conversations with so wide an audience is one of the many blessings taken for granted on the internet, and I believe we should all jump at the opportunity to be proven wrong. So, I've been talking about these two ideologies as if you have to pick a side, where they're two separate groups diametrically opposed as enemies, but they're really not. We are all both selectively objectivists and subjectivists. Just as subjectivists can find themselves agreeing with a normative assessment, so too can objectivists manage to feel emotions that override the standard they've set for a film. The thing that separates the two sides is the way you present your arguments, so hopefully this has helped clear up a lot of the prominent misunderstandings that have come up in the criticism world. Personally, I see storytelling as a representation and reflection of our own humanity. I feel like the human nature part of it is incredibly essential. There is a certain ethereality to it, something deeply embedded in the human experience that allows a set of characters and events to move beyond the text of a page. You can evoke fear, wonder, conflict, tension, laughter, all through a fabricated creation of your own imagination. I believe that what makes us human is what we search for in film, whether we're talking about talking toys, time travelers, Legos, or even food. Their ability to emote and reflect our shared concept of morality, or lack thereof, is without question what endears us to them. Whether or not we agree on how we go about discussing art, I hope we can all agree that art is, if nothing else, undeniably human. And that's what I've got. If you're interested in philosophy, please check out all the smart people that have done infinitely more research than I. All I hope is that I'm able to get some people to think a bit more about the way they use words in debate or friendly conversation. This topic has certainly done that for me. And hey, maybe even provoke someone's curiosity for storytelling or linguistics. If you're interested in checking out my actual analysis of The Last Jedi, you can find those two videos on my channel. Also, I'd recommend checking out my Letterboxd account. Somehow, it's easier to write a funny 2-sentence review than create a full psychoanalysis of art criticism, so you'll find I post a lot more over there. I've recently been doing a Disney Plus binge going through their animation catalog, so if you have any investment in that journey or have any recommendations for good films, you're welcome to connect with me over there. I do hope to make videos more often like this. I hope to make more videos, period. But I like to think this is a positive start. So thank you for watching, and I'll catch y'all next time.
Oh no. These facts and opinions look so similar.
Don't worry about it. Happens all the time.